All right, hello there, online class and anyone else watching this recording. This is the first of two recordings that we'll have on Chapter 3 on federalism. And we're primarily looking here at what it means to have different levels of government. All right, so we're looking at levels of government, federalism. As always, really interested with his contribution made by the authors of your text, help to put it in perspective what we're covering throughout this chapter and how things have changed and where they might be going. So then, now, and next. You see this on page 90 of your text. So then, new national government and pre-existing state governments implemented the new federal system. So when we see the creation of the US Constitution, we have this new federal system. And that is a good point to make, that the state governments were already in existence. They were colonial governments and then formed into states. And now you have this national government. So there you can look at that relationship and how it got started. Now, levels of government, national, state, local, primarily national and state, but sometimes local, challenge one another on power distributions in the federal system. And next, how will the courts and political parties determine the balance between the levels of government? So we see this ongoing struggle, and where does it matter, and should it matter on which level of government will have the most authority in what areas and what that authority will mean. It's an ongoing question and will certainly be a very important question in the future. So you can see here early on in the text, looking at this issue of which level matters most and applying it to certain laws, policy issues, privileges, rights. And so in this case, to look at voting, and we may look at this as a right to be able to vote, to be able to express oneself politically. And so who should begin to have that right? Well, we can see the 26th Amendment, one of the most recent amendments to the Constitution. The age is at 18, had reduced the age from 21 to 18. But does it stay there? I mean, it doesn't go up, but can it go lower than 18? What about the primaries in the states? So the primaries to select candidates. Some states have decided to allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primaries if their birthday to the 18th birthday will be before the general election. So could they not go ahead and vote in the primary? Or could local elections in municipalities, for example, even have the voting age as low as 16? Can't get any higher than 18, but can it actually go lower depending on that state or local government? And then what we can also see here is, how can one vote? And does it make a difference? And can there be different interpretations on what is allowed or not allowed? So we have the state of Pennsylvania just recently ruling that the mail-in ballot was unconstitutional. Well, there are going to be other states that have the mail-in ballot. And my guess is some of you watching this recording know of people who vote through mail-in ballots. So if that's no longer used in one state, what does it mean if it's used in another state? So how could there be a determination that it's unconstitutional in one state and constitutional in another? And is this perhaps ultimately the role of the US Supreme Court and perhaps other federal courts? So how do you make these determinations? Can there be differences among the different levels of government? Now, going back into history, we can see once again an interesting event that helps to lead to having some parts of the national government in a permanent basis and to establish a more involved national government. So in the late 1700s, early 1800s, you had piracy on the high seas. Notice here, just to look at the physical geography of North Africa and Europe, that you have what's a very textbook example of a choke point. And notice that the Strait of Gibraltar. So you have a very difficult process there of getting ships through that area, a very strained process, right? Not too many ships at one time can get in there. And so then when those ships are going through the strait, now you have potentially a vulnerable situation for those ships with the piracy from North Africa with very limited government control. Now, to combat that, how do you go about doing that from a national perspective? Don't you need a fairly large navy to be able to fight that, to fight the pirates? Or you're going to either pay the pirates off. That's not probably going to be something that can be sustainable. Or you now rely upon other countries for their navies, and that's probably not sustainable as well. So to establish a navy to fight piracy, you have to have a sense of permanence there on that part of the national government, right? It's not going to involve just one state or a collection of states. It's the whole country that has to buy in to say we have a navy, we have a very effective navy and a navy that is permanent, and you have career individuals on board the ship, because this is not a case where people can just show up on the weekends, right? Because you've got a case where you're going to have people out at sea for months at a time. So it is a career choice. And so the U.S. Constitution, USS Constitution, one of these ships that's been around for a long time and it's still commissioned. And there you have the crew, recent crew for the USS Constitution. But its job would be to patrol the coastline of the United States and to also engage in other kinds of threats to the country, such as a pirate. So in that case, you can see here that you're going to have to make an investment at the national level to maintain a navy. So it is interesting to think about, of all things, perhaps, that piracy was a reason to lead to a much larger national government than what many people in positions of decision-making in the late 1700s, early 1800s would have perhaps wanted, but you've got to have it if you want to maintain protection for the country. So there are different systems that are used when it comes to this question of levels of government. There are some places that have just one central system. One central system is the sovereign government, the unitary system. You can read about that on page 92. Some of the best examples here: France, United Kingdom, Netherlands, a very unified system, as we can see there, organized from the top down. And perhaps that works more effectively in more compact areas and not perhaps relatively not that large of countries compared to some other countries. But we can see here some places that have had the unitary system. And you can Google this and you'll find many other countries around the world that use a unitary system. And then you have the confederal system or confederation on page 92. Here you have several independent sovereign states agree to cooperate. So it becomes like a compact among states, and create a central governing body. And notice that the central governing body is not a sovereign government. So it's created by the states. And so it can be certainly one of those ways of looking at it. If the states create it, they can dissolve it. So there's very limited and temporal authority for that central governing body. The United Nations can somewhat be used as an example of a confederation. But even there, you can see that some states have more power than others. So how about think about this, maybe consider in your own thoughts before you perhaps look it up or when I move on to the next slide. But, what are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council? So there's well over 100 countries in the world, and that would be connected in some ways to the United Nations. You have 15 that would be on the United Nations Security Council that would make votes on security resolutions that would speak for the whole United Nations. But of those 15, 5 are permanent members. So the other 10 are rotated out, but the 5 stay there. And so what would be those 5 countries that would be permanent members of the UN Security Council? Think that one over. And we'll talk that over here in class. But if those of you taking this online, you can maybe ask somebody else or just kind of write it down in your notes. And here's what we'll have in a more extended discussion for the face-to-face class. But group discussion, or write this down in your notes. So are there other countries that should join the United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France as permanent members of the UN Security Council? So those are the 5 permanent members. Nuclear powers, they have nuclear weapons, and also we're on the winning side of World War II. So we can still see a legacy of World War II here today. These were the Allies, right? They were on the same side. So working together in many ways. So should there be other countries that should join them? Maybe you can think of some countries that maybe would be in that position. So when you look at unitary system, confederal system, then we have something perhaps somewhat in between. Maybe we could look at that as a sweet spot in that way of looking at the differences there on levels of government, on that continuum. So is the federal system the sweet spot between extremes? It does have some way of kind of combining the two, doesn't it? So at least 2 levels of government in which each level has sovereignty over different policy matters in geographic areas. And perhaps that becomes a key part, is to look at geographic areas. So again, the question of having perhaps not so much of a compact territory and in different kinds of histories or land areas, it might lend itself to say we need to have something beyond just a unitary system, but have some organization at the national level as well. So what are other countries that have a federal system? I would imagine that you can think of some that would be in that category. You might think of some as you drive down the highway, the interstate highway, and you see some license plates from countries that have different a federal system as well. So for example, Canada has a federal system. So you think of all the different provinces that are in Canada, and they also have territories that don't have enough population to be a province. So there, our neighbor to the north has a federal system. And then you have a federal system in Mexico. So generally on the interstate highway system, the more north you go, the more likelihood that you would see a license plate with a Canadian license. And more south you go, more likely you're going to see license plate with a Mexican license. So our 2 neighbors are federal systems. And then we have Germany is also a federal system. So in many ways, you're looking at the size of the countries that perhaps explains in some ways having a system like this. Russia also is a federal system. Brazil, very large country, also a federal system. So maybe there's something to be said there about the larger the country, the more likely it would be a federal system. Now, the federal systems share power, right? So one way of looking at it is concurrent powers. And so this is on page 96, governing functions exercised by both state and national governments. That's what a concurrent power would be. So they both do this, right? And make policy a little bit vague in that one, right? Because they clearly do that, but that can be a case where there could be ways in which that policy could be found to be unconstitutional, right? But clearly that can be the situation. Policies on education, drugs, healthcare, those kind of things. Raise and spend money, taxes, right? Borrow money, that's an interesting one. Implement policy, so the way to put that policy into action, they can do that. And charter banks and corporations, that's also very interesting. So some states may have more banks and corporations than others, depending on their policies, their taxes and regulations. Establish courts, so we know that there are state court systems as well as federal court systems in the United States. And the last one, a little bit different here, eminent domain. So both state and national governments can, we use the word take property to be used for the public good. Now, to say take, it does mean that people are going to be compensated, but they may not be compensated to the degree that they would find to be most supportive. Generally, it would, the argument, the amount of compensation is based on what the market values the property. So that may not be what the individual who's losing that property may value. But that is something that both state and national governments can do. So when you look at the national government and power on pages 97 and 98, you can also almost come to the conclusion that the national government, if it makes a good enough argument, can do pretty much whatever it wants. And it's understandable that you can get to that conclusion because of the implied powers. The elastic clause are also referred to as the necessary and proper clause. And it's, I think, a very fair question. For the sake of what is good for the country, can the national government go beyond what is specifically written in the Constitution? And that would be a fair question to say, how can that be good for the country to go beyond what is specifically written? But perhaps there are demands and innovations and changes that are going to require a constitution that allows a government to pivot and to adapt. And so that's what the implied powers are intended to do. And so it may be catch-all and it may expand the power of the national government, but just like the title suggests, is it necessary? And then again, you can have these differences, you can have innovations at the local level, experimentation, as your book mentions, differences among the states, but does it come back to say there does need to be an agreement that everyone has some commonality here by going with the belief that this is the supreme law of the land. So state and local governments are thereby obligated to comply with national laws that implement national enumerated and implied powers. So enumerated, it's written down. Implied, it's suggested through the necessary and proper clause. So again, perhaps a broad scope for the federal government. And if you're a state or local government, you're obligated to go along with that, even if you may not like it. And that, of course, raises some questions there on to what degree does the state or local government have to go along with it. But that's the supremacy clause. So here we can see one of the interesting contributions that occurred just a couple of years ago and involving treaties with Indian nations. And that you can go into more detail about that on page 98. It certainly involves Oklahoma and really involves, to be more specific, Eastern Oklahoma. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with what's called the McGirt case. So McGirt versus Oklahoma in 2020. Oklahoma, and this is the outcome by the Supreme Court, the majority of the people on the Supreme Court. Oklahoma does not have the authority to prosecute serious crimes committed by Native Americans on land that was part of a historic reservation. And that's involving then the agreements of the powers in government and where that power would come from, which is Article 1, Congress, and its negotiations with the Indian tribes. And so since this was never resolved, as far as, again, the majority of the court was concerned, Oklahoma can't take this area of law enforcement over. It is still up to the Native American tribes on land that is controlled by the Native Americans, involving people of those tribes or of some tribe and some heritage. Perhaps that might be a bit of a questionable area there on how this would apply. But this is certainly one of those things, one of those outcomes where we're looking at trying to see how this works with the people who are living here, and an agreement that no one wants to see people who have committed horrendous crimes to be set free, but also to say there is a consequence by not resolving the agreements within treaties and following those agreements. And so what should be the outcome here, right? So if the courts look at this and say, well, you didn't really follow what you were supposed to do, but it's too difficult to get you to do that now, and so we'll just overlook it. Well, is that a good outcome, right? And for enough of the Supreme Court, enough members on the Supreme Court, it was not a good outcome. So you had to go a different direction. And we're still looking at that issue, and we can see here that interpretations lead to different changes and strategies and challenges that we're faced with here today and will be faced with in the future. All right, we'll stop there. And again, this is our first recording on federalism. Our next recording will look at some of the historical changes of federalism, and again, go into more of the details of intergovernmental relations and how it applies to federalism.